A young billionaire walked across the gleaming marble floor of the New York headquarters she herself owned and had built up. Yet not one person stood to welcome her. Nobody recognized her face, and nobody thought to ask her name or her reason for being there. Instead, she was politely told to wait in the chilly corridor, as though she were nothing more than an outsider who had wandered in off the busy city streets. Meanwhile, on the far side of the sprawling boardroom, hidden behind thick panels of frosted glass, the executives running her empire were laughing and boasting about their power, fully convinced they held total control, with no idea that the actual owner of the company was sitting only a few feet away. Audrey Davis had been seated in the sleek lobby of her own company for exactly 6 minutes, listening to 12 men chuckling behind the glass. Not one employee had recognized her when she stepped through the revolving door. The receptionist, a young woman named Chloe wearing wireless earbuds and a nervous, apologetic smile, had courteously asked her to take a seat in the waiting area. She explained that the executive committee was in the middle of a highly confidential session and asked whether Audrey had a scheduled appointment. Audrey chose to say nothing. Her silence spoke for itself, and the only hint of her real identity was the heavy antique watch on her left wrist. No one in the vast city of New York had laid eyes on her in weeks. Beyond the frosted glass of the boardroom, the blurred figures moved with the smug assurance of people who are certain no one is watching them. One of them, a tall man in a bold maroon tie, slammed his hand on the wooden table amid a wave of loud laughter. That was David Foster, the chief operating officer her late father had brought on board exactly 15 years earlier, back when Audrey was still finishing her middle school homework in the dusty back room of their very first textile plant. David had always felt like an older brother to her, someone she trusted completely, at least until 3 weeks ago. Audrey had spent those 3 weeks in Boston, working tirelessly to negotiate and finalize a huge expansion deal that would nearly triple Vantage America's manufacturing output along the East Coast. Every Friday without fail, she sent a thorough progress update back to headquarters. And every Friday, David responded promptly with a reassuring executive summary, telling her everything was fully under control and that she ought to take a moment to enjoy Boston. She had believed him completely, trusting a man who had been a cornerstone of the company for more than a decade. Her trust collapsed 2 days ago when Matthew Reed, the veteran accountant who had spent 22 years watching over every cent of the business, phoned her late at night. He was the same man who had patiently shown her how to read a balance sheet when she was barely 12. He called at exactly 11 p.m., his normally steady voice shaking with panic. He told Audrey she needed to get back to New York right away, no later than 6 the following evening. When she asked what was going on, he told her the board had called an emergency meeting for a major capital expansion, claiming they had her explicit written approval. Audrey remembered feeling the floor of her rented Boston apartment tilt beneath her. She told Matthew firmly that she had never authorized anything of the sort. Matthew answered gravely that he already knew that. Which was exactly why he was calling in the middle of the night. Vantage America wasn't just a profitable business to her. It was the sacred inheritance her grandmother, Clara Davis, had bravely built in 1978 with nothing but 4 simple weaving looms and a bank loan no one else would give a woman on her own. It was the impressive textile empire her father, Robert Davis, had grown over 30 years into the country's largest exporter of technical fabrics. Ever since a sudden heart attack claimed her father's life in under an hour, exactly 4 years ago, Audrey had held a 51% controlling stake by inheritance. By law, no one could sell Vantage America without her signature. But a sudden capital expansion was a completely different threat. If they managed to issue enough new shares and quietly sell them off to a predatory outside investment fund, her 51% majority would be diluted into a powerless minority in an instant. On paper she would technically still hold her original shares, but in practical terms she would lose control of the company forever, robbing her family of everything they had built. The only legal way to authorize such a drastic emergency expansion without the majority shareholder physically present was through a specific power of attorney, personally signed by Audrey. She had, in fact, signed one 2 years earlier, so David could approve minor operating expenses while she finished her master's degree in Minneapolis. But that document carried a strict expiration date, and it had officially lapsed 14 months ago. She had told Matthew she needed to see the original forged paperwork to know exactly what had been shown to the notary. He promised to do everything in his power to get it to her before the 6 o'clock deadline. Now, sitting in that pristine glass-walled waiting area, Audrey quietly watched her own faint reflection layered over the arrogant laughter of the men trying to strip away everything her family had built with their own hands. Oddly, she didn't feel a burning fury. Instead, she felt something colder, more deliberate, and far more useful. She held on to complete silence, remembering something her wise grandmother had taught her long ago. That stillness is exactly where a devastating storm gathers its strength. A sharp burst of laughter cut through the thick glass, a sign David was in the middle of another supposedly clever story. Audrey didn't need to make out the words to recognize that smug tone in his voice, the same self-satisfied tone he always used whenever he'd gotten his hands on something that wasn't rightfully his. Suddenly her phone buzzed hard in the pocket of her tailored navy jacket. It was an encrypted message from Matthew. He finally had the document, and the signature on the notarized power of attorney was definitely not hers. The digital clock on the hallway wall grimly showed 40 minutes remaining before the emergency board session was set to end. Audrey drew a slow, steadying breath, touched her father's heavy watch on her wrist, and fixed her eyes on the glass door where David Foster kept laughing, utterly unaware that the true owner of the empire sat barely 4 meters away. She was waiting for exactly the right moment to walk in and shatter their delusions. Just then, among the shifting shapes inside the bright room, one figure turned toward the hallway and went completely still. It wasn't David. It was Paul Sterling, the youngest financial analyst on the executive team, barely in his 20s. Paul froze in place, his striped tie slightly askew, his eyes wide with shock as he stared through the narrow gap in the frosted glass. He had recognized Audrey instantly from an old family photo that still hung proudly in her late father's corner office. His hand hovered nervously near the glass door handle, torn between professional duty and the sudden, dawning realization of disaster. Audrey slowly shook her head, just a fraction, sending a silent but unmistakable order. Paul understood at once. He lowered his shaking hand and turned back to the massive oak table, pretending to study papers he wasn't really reading. The large analog clock on the hallway wall now read 5:22 in the afternoon, only 38 minutes left before the session would close for good. That gave Matthew 38 agonizing minutes to race across the chaotic city streets with the official forensic report proving the signature was completely fake. Audrey pulled out her phone again and reread Matthew's terrifying forward message confirming her worst suspicions. Someone highly skilled had fabricated a binding legal document using her identity, and it had to be someone with deep access to her old files and genuine signatures. Her mind went immediately to David, the man who had spent 15 years smoothly running the company's daily affairs, the man who always fondly called her the little boss at family dinners. Then her thoughts turned to her formidable grandmother. Clara Davis was exactly 83 years old and had a razor-sharp memory more precise than any modern accounting system. She lived on the quiet edge of New York, in the same brick house where she had hand-stitched the very first technical patterns for Vantage America. Audrey quickly texted her grandmother, asking for urgent help at headquarters. Clara's reply came back in under 60 seconds, saying she already suspected something was badly wrong because David had been dodging her calls for weeks. She said she was already in a private car, heading straight for the office tower. A small, proud smile touched Audrey's lips. No matter her age, her grandmother never waited passively for instructions, she simply acted. Inside the soundproof room, the treacherous meeting rolled steadily onward. Through the frosted glass, Audrey could make out dark shapes leaning forward eagerly, hands jabbing at thick stacks of legal papers. She recognized a deeper voice that seemed to dominate the discussion. It belonged to Bruce Carter, the smooth outside advisor David had mysteriously brought into the executive circle exactly 8 months earlier. Audrey had never fully trusted him, he always spoke with far too much confidence for someone who'd been with their historic company for such a short time. It was Bruce who had carefully drafted the new corporate governance rules the board had hastily approved the previous fiscal year. Bylaws that quietly hid a loophole for fast-tracked capital expansion. That obscure clause, ostensibly meant for situations demanding urgent liquidity, was the very mechanism being exploited right now. It was a dangerous institutional trap she had unfortunately signed without reading closely enough, foolishly relying on the brief summary David had handed her. The young receptionist, Chloe, approached Audrey cautiously once more, offering a tall glass of sparkling water and asking if she was all right after such a long wait. Audrey accepted the glass with perfect composure, saying she was simply waiting for someone special and that there was no need to announce her presence. At exactly 5:34 in the afternoon, Audrey's phone buzzed violently against her palm again. This time it was a heavily encrypted email forwarded by Matthew from his personal account, deliberately avoiding the compromised company servers. The subject line read, "Urgent handwriting forensic analysis." Audrey opened the attachment with remarkably steady hands, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. It was a thorough 2-page legal report, officially signed by a certified forensic expert whom Matthew had known and trusted for years. The conclusion, boldly underlined in red, was unmistakable. The signature on the power of attorney submitted to the city notary did not match any genuine signature Audrey Davis had produced in the past decade. It had been perfectly forged using advanced cryptographic handwriting replication software, rare technology offered by only a handful of specialized firms nationwide. Before joining Vantage America as an independent advisor, Bruce Carter had once served as CEO of exactly one of those specialized firms. Audrey closed her eyes for a brief, painful moment as the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. This was not simply David acting out of sudden ambition or executive burnout. This was a carefully engineered conspiracy, built over many months, carried out with the help of someone who knew precisely how to skirt the edges of corporate law without openly breaking it, until the final blow. She felt a sharp pang of sorrow well up before the righteous anger finally arrived. David had been a steady, comforting presence in her life since she was 14. He had personally taught her how to run a heavy textile press. He had shown her how to calculate profit margins and haggle with stubborn, wary suppliers. And yet here he was, on the other side of a glass wall, expertly engineering her total financial ruin. Her phone lit up again, an internal encrypted message from Paul, taking a serious professional risk by texting her from his own laptop. He warned that they were about to call the final binding vote in 15 minutes, and that Bruce was insisting her physical presence wasn't necessary given the notarized document. Paul begged her to step in immediately. Matthew would need at least 20 more minutes to fight through city traffic and arrive with the original paperwork, the only proof a judge would accept to void a fraudulent corporate vote. Audrey rose gracefully for the first time in over 30 minutes, smoothing the lapels of her navy jacket, the exact shade her father used to wear into his toughest corporate battles. She checked the heavy antique watch on her wrist one last time, then walked purposefully toward the heavy glass door, fully intent on stopping the treacherous vote. As her hand settled on the cold steel handle, she heard David's voice ring out clearly across the room, and his words made her pause for a split second. "Let's move straight to the final vote," he said. "Audrey Davis, as everyone knows, is currently out of the country and unfortunately won't be able to join today's emergency session." The arrogant statement hung in the air, delivered with such total confidence that not a single highly paid executive in the room bothered to question it. Audrey tightened her grip on the handle but didn't turn it just yet. Inside, the oldest and most respected board member, a distinguished white-bearded man named Isaac Pratt, slowly raised a weathered hand. He said, firmly but politely, that a capital expansion of this scale ought to wait until Audrey could review it herself. Even with a notarized document in hand, he argued, pushing ahead now felt reckless and rushed. David answered smoothly, in that infuriatingly calm voice, that time was short and that the outside investment fund, Crown Capital Partners, would pull its lucrative offer if the vote wasn't finalized today. Bruce Carter jumped in immediately, sliding a thick black folder across the polished oak table to intimidate the older board member, coldly stating that the power of attorney had already been validated by a licensed state notary and that there was no legal obstacle to moving forward at once. Audrey felt her stomach twist into knots at the mention of Crown Capital Partners, a name she had never once seen in any official financial report. Still standing just outside the glass door, she quietly pulled out her phone and searched the unfamiliar name. The results loaded almost instantly, confirming exactly what she had feared. Crown Capital Partners was an obscure fund, registered barely 14 months earlier, with its supposed headquarters inside a small, generic tax office in Delaware. It had no public financial history, no known operations, and no trace of legitimate leadership. It was nothing but an empty shell. Audrey instantly understood the full scope of the scheme built behind her back. They weren't just trying to dilute her majority stake. They were planning to sell off Vantage America's most valuable, most profitable assets to a ghost fund almost certainly controlled by Bruce or his hidden partners, at a price far below its real worth. After a few quiet months, that shell fund would resell those same premium assets, multiplying their illegal profits many times over. David and Bruce would quietly pocket the difference, leaving her holding nothing but the empty title of a gutted company. Her phone buzzed again. A message from her grandmother. Clara said she was exactly 10 minutes away and told Audrey to trust Isaac Pratt completely, since he had always been fiercely loyal to her father. Audrey took a shaky breath, finding some comfort in knowing she had at least one true ally inside that room of thieves. Inside, the vote moved steadily forward as David confidently asked those in favor of the capital expansion to raise their hands. 6 hands went up slowly but deliberately. Audrey counted from outside, her pulse pounding in her throat. 6 out of 12, they needed 7. Isaac Pratt kept his weathered hand flat on the table. Paul Sterling, seated nervously at the far end of the room, kept his hands in his lap too, though his darting eyes betrayed the weight of the moment. Bruce flipped through his notes and announced loudly that they needed exactly one more vote for the majority. David scanned the room, calculating whom he might pressure into tipping the balance. It was at that precise, fragile moment that Audrey decided she could not stay hidden a second longer. She turned the heavy steel handle and pushed the glass door open wide. The silence that followed was absolute, so heavy that even the circulating air seemed to stop moving. 12 startled heads snapped toward the doorway at once. David Foster went pale, his mouth falling slightly open as though he were looking at a ghost. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Audrey said, her voice calm and melodic, stepping slowly into the bright room. "Forgive the interruption, but it looks like you were voting on something rather important regarding my company, without me." No one dared say a word. The only sound to break the heavy quiet was Bruce's black folder slipping from his trembling fingers and hitting the table. David stammered her name, scrambling to recover his composure. He weakly claimed they all believed she was still in Boston, and that they would have waited had they known she was coming back. Audrey looked straight through him and said quietly that she already knew that, which was exactly why no one had bothered to tell her about this supposedly urgent meeting. She walked slowly around the massive table and stopped beside the large empty leather chair at its head. The seat that rightfully belonged to her as majority shareholder. She chose not to sit, preferring to stand and tower over the men who had plotted her downfall. Locking eyes with Bruce Carter, she calmly asked him to explain to the entire board why her historic company was about to sell its most strategic assets to Crown Capital Partners, a 14-month-old entity based out of a Delaware tax office that barely existed outside of paperwork. Bruce's composed expression visibly tightened, a small twitch betraying his rising panic, though he tried to hold on to his professional mask. He claimed loftily that the fund's financial details were strictly confidential and that he wasn't authorized to share them with the board. Audrey cut him off instantly, her voice slicing through his weak defense, clarifying that she hadn't asked whether he was authorized, she had asked why. Isaac Pratt leaned forward heavily, studying Bruce with a mix of shock and deep suspicion. He turned to David and bluntly asked whether the chief operating officer had known about this all along. David stammered evasively that he had fully trusted Bruce's supposedly independent analysis and insisted the whole procedure had strictly followed proper legal channels. Audrey stayed perfectly composed, stating that the entire fraudulent process rested on a notarized document she had never signed. Each word landing like a heavy stone. A shocked murmur rippled through the room as several board members turned toward David for answers. Bruce spoke too quickly, his voice cracking as he insisted such an accusation was impossible since the document had been fully validated by a licensed state notary. Audrey pressed him hard, demanding to know exactly who had supposedly verified that forged signature. No one dared answer. Suddenly Audrey's phone buzzed hard in her pocket again. It was a quick message from Matthew confirming he was finally inside the building, riding the elevator up, carrying the original documents with him. Audrey lifted her gaze back to David. He no longer looked anything like the confident executive who had been laughing loudly just an hour before. He looked completely broken. Audrey coolly suggested they proceed with their precious vote, but only after welcoming a very special guest. She wanted everyone in the room to know exactly who. The heavy boardroom door swung open once more, this time with a commanding thud. In the doorway stood an elderly woman with neatly pinned white hair and eyes forged from solid iron. Clara Davis leaned heavily on a beautifully polished wooden cane that had once belonged to the founder of the textile empire. She greeted the terrified room, her narrowed eyes sweeping over every face as though reading each hidden lie at once. She remarked dryly that she seemed to have arrived just in time for the most interesting part of the afternoon. Clara moved slowly toward the center of the room with the unmistakable authority of a woman who had walked those same floors for 46 years. No one dared interrupt the heavy silence as she paused to study each executive in turn. Finally she fixed her gaze on David Foster. Without raising her raspy voice, she calmly reminded him that she still remembered him as a skinny 12-year-old sneaking apples from her backyard garden, and that she never imagined he would grow up to steal something far more valuable from her own family. David dropped his gaze to the table, unable to meet the eyes of the woman who had practically watched him grow up. He whispered her name weakly, trying to insist the situation wasn't what it looked like. Clara lowered herself slowly into the leather chair Audrey had respectfully pulled out for her, and sternly told David to explain himself. He had exactly as long as it took her granddaughter to drink a glass of water. A suffocating silence settled over the boardroom. Bruce Carter tried to jump in to salvage his collapsing scheme, but Clara raised a wrinkled hand and silenced him instantly, informing him sharply that she hadn't asked for his opinion, and wouldn't be wanting it anytime soon. Audrey, standing tall by the large glass window, felt a sudden warmth cut through the toxic tension. Her grandmother still had the uncanny ability to command an entire room of powerful men without ever raising her voice above a whisper. Just then the boardroom door opened for a third time, revealing a heavily winded Matthew Reed, his usually pale face flushed red from sprinting across the city, a thick leather folder clutched tightly under his arm. He had worked for the Davis family for 22 years, and Audrey had never seen him so rattled. Gasping for breath, he apologized for the sudden intrusion but insisted he had critical forensic information the board needed to review before any binding vote proceeded. David made one last desperate attempt to reassert his authority, protesting that this was a highly confidential executive session and no place for an accountant to interrupt. Audrey overruled him instantly, her voice carrying absolute command, and told Matthew to go ahead. The loyal accountant carefully opened the worn folder and pulled out two sensitive documents, laying them on the table with great care. He pointed to the first, identifying it as the disputed power of attorney submitted to the state registry that very morning. Then he pointed to the second. A certified forensic handwriting analysis by a licensed judicial expert, proving conclusively that the signature did not belong to Audrey Davis. Isaac Pratt leaned eagerly over the table, adjusting his glasses to examine the damning paperwork. He muttered that this was an extremely serious crime. Matthew agreed, adding that he had gone through the official notary communication logs and found that the phone appointment used to authorize the fraudulent document had been booked exactly 3 weeks earlier from a registered internal company line, not from Audrey's personal phone. Isaac demanded to know exactly which internal extension had been used. Matthew hesitated a beat, glancing at Audrey, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of approval. He stated plainly that the call had come from Bruce Carter's private office. Every eye in the room instantly swung toward Bruce, whose face had gone completely bloodless. His voice cracked as he called the accusation absurd, insisting frantically that anyone with basic building access could have used that phone line. Matthew stayed calm, countering that whoever did it would also have needed access to the highly restricted cryptographic handwriting software that Bruce's former consulting firm had exclusively developed exactly 4 years earlier. The silence that followed felt entirely different from before, the heavy, undeniable silence of the truth finally settling into place. Clara rose slowly again, leaning on her cane, and walked until she stood directly in front of the shaking advisor. In a chillingly calm voice, she said her late husband had built this empire with his own calloused hands, starting with just 4 simple looms, and that her brilliant son had multiplied that beginning over 30 years, yet Bruce had actually believed he could steal it all with nothing but a laptop and a forged signature. Isaac Pratt slammed the folder shut with a sound like a judge's gavel, announcing he was withdrawing his vote and demanding the entire process be annulled pending a criminal investigation. The other board members, who an hour earlier had blindly backed the malicious expansion, now shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, trading horrified glances. Martin, another senior executive, quickly raised his hand, insisting he was withdrawing his support too and had no idea the document was fraudulent. David, still standing rigidly near the head of the table, suddenly looked as though he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Audrey stepped close to him and said quietly that they didn't need to turn this into a spectacle in front of the whole board. This, she told him, was simply the truth finally coming into the light, in the very room where he had tried so hard to bury it. She stopped right in front of him, speaking in a low, private murmur that only the two of them could hear even though the room stayed dead silent. She reminded him that she had trusted him completely for 15 years, letting him guide the company after her father's death, because she truly believed he loved its legacy as much as her father had. David's eyes filled with shameful tears. He whispered that he really did love the company, but that everything had spiraled entirely out of his control. He tried weakly to shift the blame, saying Bruce had convinced him this was the only way to save the empire from a supposed liquidity crisis. Audrey stared at him in genuine shock, asking what crisis he could possibly mean, since the detailed financial reports she reviewed every week showed strong, healthy numbers. David lowered his tear-filled eyes in shame, and in that moment Audrey understood he had falsified those reports too. Clara, still standing firmly by the window, raised her cane and pointed it at the heavy doors, coldly telling the young advisor it was time to call a criminal defense lawyer, not negotiate a severance package. Bruce gathered his scattered papers with shaking hands, staying silent, knowing any attempt to defend himself would sound hollow against the mountain of evidence. Audrey turned slowly to face the rest of the stunned board, who watched her with a mix of respect, shock, and shame. With the calm, unwavering authority of a true leader who never needed to raise her voice to be obeyed, she announced that the fraudulent vote was permanently annulled, and that from that moment on she would be personally overseeing every strategic decision at Vantage America. No one dared object. It was then that Paul Sterling, the young analyst who had recognized her first, timidly raised his hand. In an unsteady but determined voice, he said her name and told her there was something else she needed to know. Every eye turned to him. Audrey gently encouraged him to speak, feeling a growing sense of dread that this long afternoon was only beginning to reveal the full extent of the betrayal. Paul swallowed hard, wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers, and revealed that David hadn't acted purely out of ambition or because Bruce had manipulated him. He explained that over the last 2 days he had been digging through the restricted international wire transfer records and had found large, regular payments moving over the past 8 months, funneled from a hidden offshore account tied to Crown Capital Partners straight into a secret personal account registered under David Foster's name. David's tear-streaked face collapsed in horror, his voice breaking into a desperate whisper as he weakly denied it. But his hollow tone already carried the sound of defeat rather than denial. Paul slid his laptop to the center of the table, turning the bright screen so every executive could see the digital proof for themselves, pointing to a long column of dates and figures. He explained that every 15 days for 8 straight months, the exact same large sum had moved from the same shell account tied to the ghost fund. Isaac Pratt pushed his glasses higher, studying the screen with a deep frown, and muttered that this was no ordinary corporate loan or consulting fee, it was a carefully structured bribery scheme. David sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands, and admitted brokenly to the silent room that he had desperately needed the money. His youngest daughter had fallen seriously ill a year earlier, and the costly experimental treatment at a private clinic had been draining his executive salary dry. Audrey felt a sudden tightness in her chest, a flash of genuine sympathy, though nowhere near enough to excuse the destruction of her family's legacy. She told him softly that if he had simply been honest and asked for help, she would have done everything possible to support him as family, not just as an employer. David kept his eyes locked on the table, sobbing quietly that his own stubborn pride had kept him from begging for charity from the daughter of the man who had given him everything. Clara shook her silver head slowly, her voice heavy with ancient wisdom and sorrow, saying that misplaced pride had ruined far more good families than any economic downturn ever could, and that David should have known better after all his years by her side. Suddenly commotion broke out near the hallway. Thomas Vance, the head of building security, burst in, badge swinging against his chest, breathless. He apologized to Audrey for the interruption but urgently reported that someone was attempting a major external cyber attack on the company's servers. The attack had begun 3 minutes earlier from an unknown outside IP address. Though the automated firewall had temporarily held it off, the intruders clearly knew exactly which encrypted folders to target. Aiming to erase the internal audit files and the incriminating wire transfer logs from the past year, Matthew shot to his feet, eyes wide with alarm. Paul's fingers flew across his keyboard, tracing the intrusion. After 3 tense minutes of silence, he announced triumphantly that he'd broken through the dynamic proxy mask. The attack was coming directly from a high-end corporate law firm in downtown New York, one run by Bruce Carter's closest associates. Bruce's face turned ashen, cornered by his own arrogance. Within minutes, armed police officers, led in by Thomas Vance, entered the boardroom and formally arrested both Bruce and David on charges of corporate fraud and digital espionage. As the disgraced executives were led out, Audrey's phone buzzed with an untraceable encrypted text, "This isn't over. The fund has far more powerful partners than you realize." Paul quickly traced the original $2 million in seed money that had launched the Ghost Fund 14 months earlier. The room went still as he revealed the silent backer was Mark Andrews, her late father's oldest and most trusted friend, a man who held a tiny 2% stake in the company. Mark had secretly bankrolled the entire takeover attempt out of long-simmering jealousy, hoping to turn his small share into a fortune. Mark called Audrey's phone minutes later, begging for forgiveness and blaming the whole scheme on Bruce's manipulation. Audrey put him on speakerphone for the whole board to hear, telling him coldly that her father had never needed to betray his closest friends to succeed. She told him plainly that he was no victim, but a willing accomplice, and ended the call, cutting their ties for good. 3 months later, warm afternoon sunlight filled the newly transparent glass walls of the boardroom. David was serving a reduced prison sentence in exchange for his cooperation, while his sick daughter received world-class medical care, fully paid for by a private employee charity Audrey had quietly set up. Bruce and Mark faced harsh federal sentences and total asset forfeiture. Standing peacefully beside the 4 beautifully restored original looms now displayed in the modernized lobby, Audrey smiled softly at her formidable grandmother. She had cleansed the rot from her empire and rebuilt it stronger than before. Audrey came to understand that true wealth isn't measured by numbers on a balance sheet, but by the integrity of the people who stand with you when everything shakes. A real legacy can't simply be inherited through paperwork, it has to be fiercely protected, constantly nurtured, and earned anew every day. She learned that while hard circumstances can tempt good people into terrible choices, holding fast to one's principles is the only reliable way through the darkest storms. In the end, a forged signature might steal a company for a while, but it can never replicate the deep resilience, the plain truth, and the honorable spirit of a family bound by real love and lasting respect.